Okay. Hi, Sean.
Hello.
Hi, David. Welcome, everybody, to public,
Afternoon, everybody.
hi, David. A public activity of the Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos of the Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Today, we're very glad to have with us Sean Lally, that will be in a conversation with David Salomon, who is a professor at the School of Studio 6, if I recall correctly. And I'll be doing a very brief introduction of how this conversation is framed in an ongoing cycle of conversation between design professors, and then I'll hand it on to David and Sean. The conversation will take part will be as part of the cycle called Transference, which organizes conferences, roundtables, and conversations in which design professors of the school invite professors and professionals from adjacent fields of expertise associated with the discipline and the issues at stake in their current studio, in order to establish productive forms of dialogue and aim at enriching the project by incorporating methodologies and problems operating in parallel, combination of space hypotheses, the incorporation of work ethics, and the adoption of sedimented subjects. The expansion of project capacities is sought by increasing its critical mass, deploying traditional territorialities of architecture for the construction of transversal knowledge, complexifying communication protocols, and establishing plans of knowledge and new forms of specificity, and the specific agenda within that within the cycle is ecological transference, which deploys knowledge, protocols, and cultural, technological, and programmatic normatives of architecture through the holistic and systemic understanding of the multiplicity of factors that make up a territory. The conversations seek to broaden the knowledge and conceptualize the ideas settled in large-scale thinking practices, establishing new relationships between the different strata and territorial management systems with the project. Through different techniques of organization, direction, ordering, and conceptualization of material resources and its involved actors, new forms of ecological relevance are projected through their thinking in the present. So once again, thank you, Sean. Thank you, David. I'll hand on to you guys.
Okay. Well, thank you, Manuel. Thanks for organizing this and corralling us and being flexible with us across our many different time zones here. I don't know what Switzerland is called, Central European time zone or European time zone. Anyhow, and here on the east coast of the U.S. and of course in Buenos Aires. So let me briefly do the formal introduction of Sean, and then I'll show some things or set up the conversation relative to the studio, and then we'll dive in. So Sean is an architect and a landscape architect. He's currently based in Switzerland, but for a long time has been an associate professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. We have many friends together. Of course, he's published and exhibited widely, including the Istanbul and the Venice Biennale coming up, and at the Ambiguous Territory show that I curated and ran the symposium that he also gave a talk at. And one of these days it will be in a book, hopefully by the end of the year. Sean is the author of The Air from Other Planets, A Brief History of Architecture to Come. I think very relevant for today. He's lectured widely around the world, been a guest professor at Virginia, the Pratt Institute, and at Rice down in Houston, where our friend Chris Heid is. And Lally, Sean is a recipient of the Young Architects Award from the Architectural League in New York, and the Prince Charitable Trust Rome Prize from the American Academy. I'm very jealous of that. And he's also the host of the excellent, and now long-running podcast, Night White Sky. So check that out. whether you're in the car or running or just sitting around the house. Um, Anyhow, and Sean and I have known each other for a long time. We share a UCLA education. We were there, same vintage. Share a New Jersey background, but we also share an interest in the many entanglements between architecture, humans, and non-humans, or is to say, between maybe architecture and its many environments. So, Sean, great to have you. Thank you for being.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay, so just to set up for anybody who's watching now or in the future, let me just share my screen as we do in Zoom and show you some slides or use some slides to set up a conversation. Hopefully, it will be short. I'm not always good at that, but um, so I titled the talk or this event, I should say, "What You Can't See," because I think among the things that we're interested in, or I think Sean and I are interested, Sean will tell us, but the studio is also interested in things one's senses can't quite make sense of. Things that are invisible, or things that you can't touch or smell, things that are small, things that are buried. So in the studio, we've been investigating what I've been calling this axis mundi drawing. This is a section from this, not the center of the Earth, but from underground to the top of the atmosphere that tries to capture, we might say, some of these things that we can't see. And the studio is set up within a series of studios that I've been running down in Ditella, the post-humanist skyscraper that is skyscrapers for non-humans, things like cows or data servers. Um, and this semester, we're looking at uh, capturing a skyscraper, a tower that captures carbon, but that also grows plants. So carbon or carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide, excuse me, you can't quite see. Sometimes you can see the effects of it, or you can't see where it comes from in terms of its fossil fuels until it's comes out of the ground. So there's a series of invisible things that we're trying to capture, and even in terms of the greenhouses and plants, the growth is not something one witnesses directly, right? There's questions of representation and modeling, I think, are present there as well. So again, in particular, this idea of a carbon capture and greenhouses. This is Climeworks, actually somewhere near, sort of near where Sean is. It's a kind of prototype project where they're capturing carbon and then putting some of their capturing, putting somewhere else, and some into the greenhouses. So this is the context of the studio. So this question of the non-human, the mechanical, also the informational, it's maybe not as foregrounded in this studio, but is goes under a term that Julian Varas down there coined, the orgatronic, this intertwining of the organic, the robotic, and the cybernetic, and the blurring of the boundary of these things. Or the way I've been thinking about it, another way of thinking about it is the entanglement between these many things. And I think this is where, for sure, Sean's work comes in, and the blurring between things. And here's a drawing from another drawing from the studio, again, just to set up these interests, and even in this case, a blurry, intentionally a blurry boundary between things. So this question of is there a boundary between things is maybe something we could talk about. A boundary between atmospheres, bodies, energies, zones. These are some of the terms you see on the right that I thought we might talk about and engage these issues. So again, I feel that when I was asked who do you want to invite, Sean came up immediately as someone whose own work is dealing certainly with these issues: atmospheres, bodies, energy, zones, and the other ones too. But also interested in, well, I don't know, we've never talked about this, but in the kind of what's the issue of the invisible, or architecture is often visual, but also physical presence. It has a presence. But what do you do with things that have less of a presence, or how do you put them into architecture? So again, that's how I would say I would start off this, or frame the relationship between what we're doing in the studio and the series of studios and the things that Sean is also interested in. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing so we can see one another better. And yeah, so welcome, Sean. I'll just let you say hi, and if there's anything that immediately strikes your fancy to respond, or if not, we'll frame some questions, I guess.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, I was thinking of this list and the title, like what you can't see. And if I was looking at that list, I've come to realize that the way I've been thinking about some of the things I'm going to show are kind of on two sides. There's like the capital P project, like the thing that I think is important, which I think has to do with the bodies and environment, which is this idea that we are kind of manipulating the human body through healthcare and wearables, but we're also manipulating the environment. And I think that's a kind of unique period in time in general, specifically for the discipline, which is, I think for a long time, we think about knowing more about the body, and then we advanced architecture to kind of understand it or relate to it. But now neither comes first. You can manipulate the body, you can manipulate architecture and the environment, and they both sort of work back and forth. And the other one is how we as architects represent or model, image, control. Like those are the mechanisms that we use to articulate our ideas. And I think in the last couple of years, I guess it's been said to me that you get one or two good ideas and you spend the rest of your life trying to figure them out. I think I'm still very much interested in those first two ideas. Been trying to figure them out. I think I'm really working now, realizing that there's been a long struggle trying to figure out how do you articulate them, and what's the best way to articulate them. And maybe I'll just jump and share a couple of images over here, a video, because I think there's, for a long time, like you can see even on the screen here, you have a physical model that I made with some Photoshop and photographed it. And then on the right, you have a diagram on the slide you have here, which is an ODM diagram, which is trying to show the technical side of how boundaries work. So there's like the image, the architectural image, and then there's some sort of proof that you know what you're doing, like or you think you know what you're doing. So simulations, software simulations, drawings, that type of thing. But I'll just try to share this. You cannot share screen while okay, sorry, I'll try again.
Yeah.
Okay. So here, I think you can see my screen. Can you see Nancy Pelosi?
Yep.
Hopefully you can hear her. Tell me if you can.
No.
Can you hear that? No. Is there I think there's a button I'm supposed to hit for.
Yeah. When you share, there's a little bottom left is what I remember on the share.
Share sound. Got it. Okay. So now you should be able to hear this. So this is a deep fake. And so this idea that when people don't know reality, right? Like you don't know what's real and what's not real. And it can be very diabolical. Like in this example, I'll show you real quick.
Video of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
And then he had a press conference in the Rose Garden with all this sort of visuals.
Now the doctored video in which she appears to be impaired.
And then he had a press conference in the Rose Garden with all this sort of visuals.
That clip received.
And so what's really kind of interesting about this is that you have this moment in which you can't tell what's real and what's not. And it's not a heavily exaggerated condition. It's basically just slowing down audio and video to the point where no one quite knows. There's no reason to question it, I guess is my point. And so you sort of lay out media in which something is occurring and there's no reason to question its reality. It just sort of meets the audience and dictates what you need it to do. So, which is for the GOP right-wing side of the United States politics to make them think that Nancy Pelosi should be removed from her position. A more kind of lighthearted version of it is a deep fake in which there's a comedian, Bill Hader, talking to David Letterman. This is probably, I don't even know when David Letterman was on TV, but this was, let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Someone went back to it 2 years ago, now that we have the technology, and changed it. And so I'll just show you this kind of pretty quickly. So this is Bill Hader recorded, and then you'll see very quickly what they do to the video.
I was wondering about the one, the Tropic Thunder.
Yeah, Tropic Thunder.
Where Tom Cruise. You're working with Tom Cruise. What was that experience like?
It was amazing. Like, we got to dance together.
See it, analyze it,
Sorry.
plan it, trade it, hedge it, monitor
Part
it,
of it, not part of the thing.
assess it,
This
optimize
is the other
it,
deep fake, yeah.
see it, IG it.
This is what happens when you have a video waiting to go.
That was amazing. We had like, you know, when you do a movie, you do table reads, you know, where like all the actors get together.
Oh, at the
and
beginning of
at
the
the beginning,
production?
before anything, you get together and you read through the script. And so it's like, you know, all these heavyweights, like, you know, Ben Stiller, Jack Black, Robert Downey Jr., everybody. And at the end is like me, like, you know, like, hey, just happy to be here, guys. You know, like, and some other supporting guys. And then Tom Cruise walks in.
Oh my gosh.
And even those guys are like, whoa, and he's super stoked to be there. You know, just like, yeah, oh, boom. You know, like, he's like,
Wow.
So I don't know if it's too subtle or not, but they've changed his face to be Tom Cruise. So whenever he does a Tom Cruise impersonation, he comes
he's just immediately excited when he walks into a room. And so he comes over and he sits next to me, and I think he had been briefed on some of the supporting guys, but he was like trying to place me, you know? So he sat down next to me, he's like, I love your work. And I'm like, oh, thanks. I love your work too.
So, I mean, that's like a more fun part of it. But I mean, I don't have enough to like orchestrate this into a big theory here. But, you know, obviously within art and architecture, within art and film, you know, there is quite a history of in painting, the idea of like realism or the idea of hyper reality. And the question is, you know, it's sort of striving to make something real. And then, of course, if you go beyond that, you start getting into this idea of something being beyond real and something other. And there are a couple of people who are contemporaries now in art, contemporary artists now, who do really amazing things. And one of them is the photographer Gregory Crutzen, who he takes these pictures that look rather documentary like obviously there's something a little bit more going on here, but they seem a bit like he's sort of essentially documenting moments. But if you were to watch some documentaries about him or really look at his work, what you quickly realize within a photo like this is that he has a team of like 15, 20 people working on this. And if you were to dissect it, you'd realize there's nothing natural about this. There's like 25 different light sources here. There's not enough, there's too much happening. It's like almost hyper real. And so he takes photographs of known conditions, of like settings, but he almost amplifies them to the point of being something other. There's another one, Ruud van Empel, who's a photographer as well. And he takes these photographs of people, but these are not photographs of complete people. So he takes photographs of the flowers. He takes photographs of people, their lips, their eyes, their hair, their clothing, and then he stitches them all back together in a really super flat background where he's not trying to trick you into thinking it's a true photograph, but there's no point in here where you can find a seam or a boundary and say, oh, that's somebody's eye, and that's Jennifer's eyebrow, and that's Thomas's forehead. The point is that they're all kind of, they're not real people, but they presume to be real settings. And this becomes, I think, a really interesting way to start thinking about how do we talk about strange and unknown things that we don't know in the future. Like a lot of unknowns are going to be coming into the future. And as architects, how do we think about that? Is it to be the scientist engineer and show that we can play with devices on our bodies to see and sense things? Is it to control the environment through software technologies that show you how air and temperature move and shrink and change? Or is it really to show us the environments of how we might live and socialize and engage each other and live differently, but make them look kind of hyper real so that we believe them? So it's like the Nancy Pelosi, instead of being diabolical about it, showing Nancy Pelosi slurring her words to get her removed from office, is it more to kind of tantalize people into a future, a near future that is plausible, but not here yet? And maybe the one last thing I'll show, maybe some of you have seen it, is we mentioned there's the Night White Skies podcast, and this will be coming hopefully in the next month or two, which is a move into the visual. So that'll become a program that'll be a video program. And it's going to be using video game technologies. And so one of the ones that maybe you're not, even if you don't play video games, you might not be aware of it, is The Mandalorian. So anyone who likes Star Wars and watches Disney Plus and you have a subscription to this is a great show. And this really got me thinking more and more about it when it came out last year. And since then, I've been trying to develop it. I'm going to show not too much of it, but I'll show kind of a bit of a clip here.
Part of what's been fun about collaborating on The Mandalorian with Lucasfilm and Disney is that we have been able to see through a few technical innovations and a few firsts that I think are going to have a lot of impact on the way television and movies are made moving forward. In partnership with ILM and Epic, we have put together a system whereby which we can have game engine, real-time render, and video wall technology coming together to create a backdrop for the big, beautiful world of Star Wars.
The volume is 21 feet tall, it's 75 feet in diameter, run by 7 machines, pumping the visuals onto the screen that's being created in pre-production and can be on the screen within 24 hours of being finaled.
It's incredibly impressive when you first walk out there because it completely surrounds your peripheral vision. And you really quickly forget that you're indoors and you're not out on some planet's surface. It feels like a real three-dimensional environment surrounding you because it is a three-dimensional environment.
You can allow your key creatives to all make decisions together so that the shots are captured entirely in camera, which allows for a better performance.
And what was so exciting about this is by bringing those people together, things started to click. And we started to realize, well, let's not just do green screen and interactive light. If we're going to design the whole set and game engine ahead of time, maybe we could have some in-camera effects.
Everything in the volume is designed to both light the actors and to be a background that we can directly photograph. So you end up with real-time final pixels in camera.
If you look at visual effects heavy films, you've got a film set and then it's going to go to post and it's going to get the world put in. Here we're considering all
between the Iceland location to the desert location, all within the same day of shooting.
The ability to shoot a 10-hour dawn is extraordinary. To shoot any sequence where you say, oh, this world's not quite right, let's just move it a little bit. An extraordinary number of benefits and advantages for shooting in that environment. It's mind-blowing what that tool is.
What you see is really what you get. And that's something that really means a lot to filmmakers, especially.
Okay, so I don't want to, waste your time, watch a whole movie, but, there's that side of it now where you're seeing a kind of collapse between what has been happening for a long time within gaming, but never quite had the visuals that I think would attract people like architects and designers to be able to get the quality of imagery that they wanted. And I mean, a perfect example was, even for me, I've been trying to learn new software for visuals and through various software packages. And then I decided for Venice that I was going to do it in a video game. So I made this video game for Venice that people were supposed to be able to play. COVID means now, of course, you can't have any controls or people gathering. So it's really just a clip of it plus a built prototype. But even within that, what I could do in my software packages like Cinema 4D and Octane and Redshift, the video game engines aren't quite that good yet. So it's a kind of frustrating moment right now where the quality isn't quite as good as what I could get from rendering packages, but it's pretty close. And I think once those overcome together, you're going to start realizing that you can make worlds that you can interact with, especially with avatars and with these screens like this, in which you can't see what's what, and you can turn around ideas quicker. And when you can start doing that, it's not in a weird way what happened, I think, in the past, which was how can I prove to, David, one of the things I was thinking of was like Neil Denari in Los Angeles. His work in like the late 90s, which was try to make everything hyper real, to kind of trick people or make people think that it was built or could be built or this is what it would look like. And I think what we're looking at now is the ability to make things inhabitable on screen, which isn't to trick people into thinking it's real or buildable, but to kind of immerse them in the experience and actually be able to start seeing that this is what it would be like if I could see ultraviolet or infrared, or I could hear ultrasonic, or if the climate had changed and we had different planting and we had different temperatures, how might architecture build and interact with these spaces that I think could engage, both test our ideas in new ways, but also engage a different audience, which I think is a very important kind of subset of this.
Yeah, I mean, I love like a word that didn't make it onto the list. This is representation, and you mentioned articulate. Like, how do we articulate these things? And so I think you're getting at this. How do we present issues, ideas, or how do we present the future? How does architecture, which is related to the present, let's say, what devices do we need to present the future, which is fantastic. Or it makes me also think, though, what are the issues or the topics that architecture should engage when it engages, which would be different than the artists. Like, what is Crutzen looking at in terms of the social factors of suburbia and maybe the economic ones, and maybe not the environmental ones, or what does The Mandalorian allow us to imagine, or what does film allow us to imagine? So, I mean, just like in terms of the studio, I haven't been to any of these other events, so because they're in Spanish, but like in terms of the studio, like there's a kind of like, let's say, I'm going to call it the hyper real of like, oh, there's carbon out in the air and it's not good for us. Like, let's get rid of it. There's that kind of hyper reality or quote unquote reality. But then there's a kind of hyper reality like you're describing, which is like beyond reality, like whether it be Neil and I think like, so this is, like the image that I had for atmosphere, but it could have been the image for model, which is what do we want to model? I mean, I love the term model because it is this kind of like scientific, like what will happen if we do this in the future, which is what you're describing. And a model also is kind of capture the future. What are the architectural issues, or what are the issues? I guess maybe that's not right. What are the issues that architecture wants to engage? And certainly one that you've engaged is energy and the body vis-a-vis the atmosphere. And I guess I'm wondering, like in terms of your video game for Venice, but also like how do you see that's a kind of like a more important one to take on or is that still central to your work, the body environment energy interaction? And is that different than is somehow architecture more implicated in those issues, and that's why we deal with them as opposed to other media? What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm trying to pull something up here just so I can get the proper. So in this example here, the one you have up, okay. that in that image, one of the things that that you're looking at here is obviously are these big spheres in the air. Those are intended to be kind of like drones that could go to a central location in the landscape and then come up and be activated when necessary for lighting and a set of variables. And on the ground, it was this idea of a kind of heated system. So you kind of create a convection cycle of light and heat and temperature. And so that's the energy side of it. That's the architectural space. But the other thing you have here is, which you can't quite see here, is you have people on the inside of an interior, and she has a kind of a series of like what I would be calling sensorial envelopes, like what her perceptions radiating from her body. And you can see in his hand is that he doesn't have access to that space. Meaning, so what are the kind of social dynamics that play out here of who can use space and who can't use space, who can see space and who can't. So for a long time, you know, I think we think of public space as being accessible to anyone who can get there. And so the idea is that when public space is accessible, like a park, the biggest question would be access physically, meaning is there public transportation to get there? Do we have ADA accessibility so people can move into the space and access the space and move around the space? And then it's sort of seen like, now there's maybe a false belief that if you can get people to it, we all have equal access to it. But in reality, because of healthcare and wearables, just like your phone, we don't all have the same provider. You may not have the same apps. You may not be able to cost the same subsets. You possibly don't have the same access to public space. Maybe you have an app that allows you to see an augmented reality protest or plant biology or something. And it's very possible that if there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people in that image there, that photograph, that they're all experiencing slightly different public spaces. And so, yeah, in the Biennale and in other work I'm doing, it's definitely a kind of overlap between what the body perceives and what the information is in the environment. And that I would say architecture in many ways is starting to be more like an old AM/FM dial, in which even if you have access to all of the dial, we're not all on the same dial. And so you could be all occupying the same space, but tuned to slightly different versions of the space. And that has the potential to splinter public space. It has the potential. So I think there's a lot of, and my personal belief is that I think what's amazing about architecture is we do get to create really imaginative, beautiful things, but there's also a responsibility, not just a responsibility, we're actually quite good at it, which is foreshadowing and tying together a lot of disparate connections to see what the implications what will be, spatially, socially, economically, who's affected, who's not. And quite frankly, it's because I don't think there's another discipline out there that sees the responsibility or the ability to do that. It's not going to come from those disparate entities. It's going to be the architect who sort of ties them together and sees them in a novel way and plays out the scenarios, both the positives and the negatives. So yeah, the body and the environment, I don't think can be seen as disparate things, and we can't see them as either being neutral in any way.
Yeah, I mean, again, just because I have some images ready, or these, and this is a project that we asked the students to look at, or this kind of, you know, the double curtain wall kind of zone of air in the piano building. But it's also like this question of control, or how do you control those spaces? How do you police those borders between things, or how do you open them up? And I think something like this is so literal. No, it's not literally concrete, but it's so obvious and physical and manifest. And it's like, here it is, here it is, here it is. And I think one of the things that your practice, your work, and that's why I want to call it zone rather than border, because there's that kind of, you know, like how are these things being defined rather than divided, I guess. And so I'm wondering in terms of like your representational practice, like you do often make those things come visible, right? Like we see the double lines or the hand pushing against the zone that I don't think I would see if I were there, like quote unquote there. And I'm curious about that, about this. Do we need to make those things, that even that blurriness, palpable, right? So on the one hand, it seems like we want to like break down like bodies and space, my body and your body are intertwined, but yet how do we make that maybe recognizable or legible is a better word than visible? So I'm just curious, like, because I think in your images that's very clear, and is that important to you, that making it legible to a viewer or maybe an occupant?
You mean in the built world?
Yeah, in the built world,
Yeah.
but also in the representational world.
Yeah. So in the representational world, it's important because it's the only way to show its existence. And so maybe, an example like this one and the last one, it would be something like heat. The best way to show a thermal condition, it could be like the Renzo piano, the double wall glazing system, the depth of it, the transparency of it, and then distance and materiality shows control. And even if you can't see a heat thermal system, you know that that's about trapping heat and moving it up and out of the building and so on and so forth. So it has a signifier to it, which is control and someone who's thinking about these things. In this example, thermal is translated into green and thawing of space. So snow, how do you show that? How do you show a thermal condition in the ground? Would be when there's a lot of snow. If there's a leaky, we both know from Chicago, New York, like if there's a bright green grass inside a winter field, it's because there's some heating system from a underground pipe that's leaking, and it's warming the ground. And so the question is, how do you represent that? And then I think there's graphics like the lines that show actions. There's a great book by Aubrey Annabelle, which is about rehearsing feelings. And she's talking about video games. And so this goes, again, back to the video game thing, which I find really intriguing, because when you play a game, you're actually getting an experience. So another idea would be like that guy's hand in that drawing. It could be an electrical charge. It could be a pushback. It could be a change in temperature. It could be a thermocline of temperature change. It could be an electrical shock. It could be a lot of things. But you're not going to feel those things or understand them because they can only be represented in a drawing. And so the question is, like a video game, that seems to me to be an interesting way in which if you could show things happening, your character could potentially get shocked because they interacted with it. So instead of showing a drawing of something, could you have people walking through it and playing it and realizing that they're prevented or their lifespan goes down or attack or something happens to the body? And her point in the book, Rehearsing Feelings, is a way of saying gaming, because there's so much uncertainty going forward, are video games a way in which people can rehearse complex social interactions, feelings, depressions, anxieties through gaming, so that when they interact with them in the real world or the future, we have an understanding of how to deal with complex situations. And so gaming and some of her examples are not just entertainment, but they're dealing with complexity and things that are uncertainty that we will have in the future. And so if you switch that out, if we're rehearsing feelings to like rehearsing architectures, rehearsing space, rehearsing social engagements, rehearsing aesthetics, you can start seeing people experiencing and playing space, not just being represented in space. And I don't have this all figured out or anything, but it does seem like a really kind of really more than a slightly different way of thinking about how to get people to understand both what space could look like and change, but also how them and other characters in the game might be interacting with each other differently because of it. And it's not just an objective form, it's actually a subjective experience.
I mean, this, whether it be the video game example or like the image that you're saying, like that the boundary, the experience is not just a visual experience, like that it's a tactile, right? That this gets back to like, and maybe the title of it today is a little off in terms of like it's not just about what you can't see because it's not visual. It's also because there are things that architecture engages with that are just not, have engaged the other senses. So I think your work with energy and atmosphere to really to create space to create conditions around, potential conditions around these other forces, but also then other senses, is so interesting, but also so difficult for us to model, to show, right? So like this need for a new technique, right? Moving into gaming technologies, like the need, like this issue of like whenever you want to deal with something different, you need a new technique. So I think you have always tried to do that, which I always appreciate. But this issue of architects manipulating feelings, but also sensations, like we talk about that a lot, but like how do we actually do it? So I would say one of the interests in the studio is not so much for human, right? To sort of, well, let's put it, to practice that by thinking about like non-humans, because then we don't have to worry about like, oh, show me how the human responds. It's like, can you make the carbon do something different? Can you actually like, how do you make it palpable, not just to human senses, but just like to itself maybe. So anyhow, I think that's to speak to some of the overlap of that. And those are all energy dependent, meaning that, just one last riff on that is that, like when I first mentioned this proposal to somebody, they said, well, isn't that going to produce, like to build a building like that, aren't you going to use more energy than you're going to capture, or create more pollution than you're going to capture? And he said, well, that's not really the point. The point is not so much like a zero-sum game. It's like to precisely imagine what that would be, or what else the world could be. And so I think that to me is another way that those overlaps come through. So I don't know if you saw there's a question in the chat. We don't have to, if you want to respond to that, and then we can also engage that a question and hopefully others that come in. So yeah, that's the way we're interacting today, people. So put whatever you have in the chat, and we'll address it where you can. But anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, it made me think too of, think the title of What You Can't See. I think it is an issue of like, how do you make some things that are invisible visible so that we can understand them? But I think that the slip here that I feel like has become a bit of a problem in the way how I've been working and maybe trying to change it is that people need the visual. People want, it's tough to say, but at the end of the day, it has to be commodified. And that's not always a bad thing. But you need to have people want it, because otherwise, if they don't want it, they're not willing to make any sacrifice for it. And I think there's a lot of discussions about things as how do you through like kind of moral eyebrow beating, get people to make something, to make a sacrifice. And I think another way of doing it is to say, yes, maybe there's some sacrifice, but you're going to get this thing, this quality, this event. And when we make things that are invisible visible, we're generally doing them only through representations. And then in reality, the question is it the same thing? Like, do they get that thing? And it's a tough, that's why this example, this is a project with in Columbus, Ohio, which was part physical and part virtual. And so the ground plane, the white thing at the lights has a heating system underground. It has these plastic things that glow that I was calling a digital shadow, because when they change color, it means that the invisible thing, which is an augmented reality, is also changing color. And then the augmented reality thing are a series of this spectrum of light, which is above you, which is shimmering. The idea that if the light in the future, let's say 1,000 years from now, or 500 years from now, the spectrum of light that reaches Earth isn't the most productive in the green, but it's in the near ultraviolet or purple, that will change plant life. And so the plants on the ground are a fictitious biology of botany that move. And it's only because you take your phone, scan the ground, lift it up, and then you see this other world kind of layered on top of a physical world. And that is an example for me in which you're kind of making the invisible visible, but also giving people something that's somewhat imageable. Because if you don't have that other imageable side to it, then you can see with my hands, it becomes a lot of hand waving. And it does get difficult to deliver that product. And so that's also the problem with representation, is that it can also deliver, in a weird way, the representation becomes the commodity, not the thing you're looking to deliver. You're not the sort of larger project you're hoping to show. And that's not entirely true, but when that thing gets built, you would have to have people go to it to be able to discuss it. It may not become, because even this project, I was surprised how much difficulty I had getting this thing published, which was almost zero, because people who even went to the site, if they can't photograph it. Like the only way to photograph it was to like have your phone out and take screenshots, and those never looked good. So it became this, it was a weird struggle to actually, even though all the data was there, the photographer who was paid to do such great shots couldn't take the shots because his SLR Canon couldn't image this. So it had to be done through screenshots on your phone. And so again, like the thing you represent, the thing you build, and the thing that gets put out into the press for people to understand and understand and engage, there's a divide there still. And so how do you kind of make something imageable even when it's built so people want to understand it more?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, to me, part of the problem is the kinds of things you're trying to capture. I'm going to call it. Like, I could have said image, but it's also capture, right? Like the light waves. You know, we're not talking about capturing an object, even though, like, okay, like, you know, we can understand, like, we see an image as a series of light wave, right? I mean, I know that, like, I don't know the physics, but I know that everything, you know, comes down to that. But the thing that you're trying to capture or to produce, well, capture and produce, are not the things that we are always trained to, like, pay attention to as architects or as humans, right? We just take it for granted. It's like one of my mantras of the semester has been, you know, nothing is empty, right? Like when we draw a section, there's no such thing as empty space. Like it's already full with a lot of stuff. Like what you're saying that you're trying, but that's really, it's not something you can photograph. It's not, I don't even know, well, how do you draw that? How do you, like you're saying, how do we capture it? Not just like, I mean, for press, but it's really, what we're talking about is communicating, right? Like, hey, this is what we're after. This is the, like the new reality. Like if you want to imagine it, like these kinds of images might not be enough, or we have to make images that we're not comfortable with, which is also what makes it strange. And well, it makes resistance, but it also hopefully captures an imagination. So I think that's also been, again, this agenda, like, you know, like how are we overlapping, right? The need for other modes of showing, and the limit, or not just the limits, like, oh, you can't do it, but it's also the limit of the audience that doesn't want that. They want like what they know.
Yeah.
So to push that is always to push on the comfort zone, but we're also talking about different kinds of comfort, like thermal comfort, etc. You know, your working cage is all those things, which is, you know, one of the, again, why I love it, but also why I wanted to have you.
Yeah, and it's a tough call because I'd say in the last 15, 20 years, the big version of how do you do that is scientific representation. So that becomes the mechanism for how we represent it. Because if you said to somebody, can you represent it in a drawing, you know, you're going to get like specks on a pencil with no control. And so it just being completely subjective. And so the best way to do it was to do it through scientific examples of some software from engineering that gave you laminar flow and you know, all types of imaging that could show this. And so, yeah, it's a tough question, but that's why I think the gaming is interesting, because it not only can you show images of it, but you can actually have a character engage it and make decisions based on it. And I do think I said press, but what I meant was capturing it. Yeah, capturing it before it's built is one thing, but being able to capture it after it's built is equally important because it shows that you can deliver on the concept. The only other way I can think of would be the example of the Renzo piano and the Tom Main. I'm thinking of the Federal Building in San Francisco, you know, which is to say, what is your energy bill? Because other than showing your energy bill, you can't prove that it's working or not working, right? You could do surveys, which they do, which is like, are you comfortable? Are you uncomfortable? But that becomes completely subjective based on your clothing, based on where you're from. And so, I think we have to figure out what are our metrics, because unfortunately, your electric bill sometimes becomes the biggest metric of whether or not a project is successful or a failure when it comes to energy systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my interests in like doing non-human buildings for non-humans is precisely to get out
They
of
never
that.
talk back, right?
They never talk back, and like that quote unquote comfort is not something that one has to answer. Although, if you read the literature on cows, there's a whole lot of discussion about cow comfort and productivity. Like a comfortable cow produces more meat and more milk, so that's a whole other issue. So there's a couple questions in the chat. One, Sean, if you can name example, like again, I think these come in different parts of the conversation, so let's see if we can recreate the context too a little bit too. But can you name examples in your own work or in someone else's where the technological mediations that alter your experience of public space have been used with interesting goals? That is, so I'll let you interpret that. Are you able to?
Well, I mean, maybe we went over the one, which was the one in Columbus. Another much earlier one, which was the Mac Center in Los Angeles. I only bring that one up because the simulation software programs that I was using to simulate the energy systems and then what I built and what I got were very different.
This one.
And that one. And that's just always the case. Like, just because what your tools tell you is going to happen versus what you build don't necessarily always correlate. There's lots of, and this is a small installation, but if you talk to people who are working on programs for like Foster's Gherkin, Jonathan Massey has an article about that, the difference between the ambition and the result. Because something to keep in mind, as most people who are listening know, is that basically architecture is a prototype every time. I mean, there's a reason why people go to Foster, Emineo, and Morphosis time and time again. Is because if you've done one, you do another, you've learned something from it to perpetuate. Because otherwise, you really are building something for the first time. It's a new site, it's a new climate, it's different materials. It's always a prototype. So it's very difficult, unlike industrial design, where you've manufactured it and tested it in a vacuum 1,000 times to know how it's going to function. Buildings are really, and landscapes are really, they're completely new every single time. And so it's very difficult to really be able to know performance and goals.
They're completely new, but so often so familiar. And one of the things about this project, I mean, one, it's like familiar as a kind of a tree, and it's familiar as a greenhouse, but it's like also like hyper artificial. Like all those things are artificial. Or like, I mean, I was just in a greenhouse in Chicago, and like the second you enter, you forget how like it's like, oh yeah, that's a real tree, so it's real, but it's as fake as any film set. And what I mean? Like this issue of, so what is I guess if the question is about what's the goal of that is of this kind of work, or which is not to bring the reality, like, so if the greenhouse, the goal was to bring the reality of the exotic reality of the Orient, quote unquote Orient, to England, in the case of of those things, and to suppress the artificiality of it, it would seem today that, like, maybe the goal, if one goal would be to precisely exaggerate the artificiality of that, which, not all architects are trying to do, right? They're trying to produce reality rather than to produce this hyper artificial, even though we are already artificial, right? We're a fake environment, fake natures, basically. So I think that, to me, that's one of the things that this project always did, which I only recently really understood how fake it is, and how many systems, how much effort it took to get this.
Yeah, because they're all that one shape. There's 6 of them, and the idea is that they're all different. So the fact that essentially the geometry is identical, but all the climates and environments inside are unique. And so it's just a matter of playing with 5 variables of water temperature, air velocity, lighting, plant material, that you actually get different controls. It's basically like a little laboratory. Was there another one?
There was another question about this image. Let's see, about the spheroids. What is the invisible that they are making visible? What are the actual objects? What is the aesthetics that they are incarnating? Like, what are we being made to see, I guess, is how I would interpret that question. Or and I guess maybe it's a question of what do you want us to see versus, let's say, what others might take from it. But is it that direct for you? I guess would be another, I would ask, like, you were trying to get us to see something particular?
Yeah, if you do go up, I think you had with that Odom diagram with the other one.
Sure. Yep.
I think it was like 6, yeah. So this is an example of that. This is because they're from a series. But basically, the idea of an Odom diagram from Odom from the 70s, which is just this idea of seeing a system. It could be a city or it could be a small environment. And so what you're seeing in white on the outside of the circle are existing environmental conditions. So air temperature, air humidity, air velocity, precipitation, all these things. And then what you're seeing in black are all the things that are being produced, that are being amplified. So air temperature, surface temperature, conduction, convection, spectrums of light. There are a series of things in there. And when they interact with the site, you get a boundary. So example being, if it's 45 degrees out and then you pump air or a heating system that is at 70 degrees, where those two temperatures come together, you get a behavioral boundary, and that becomes a boundary, meaning when you're on one side, it's one thing, when you're on the other side, it's another. But energy doesn't create a static geometry. So you could think of like a wall is really just ossified energy. It's locked down. And you can draw that with a line in your CAD file or Rhino, or model it in foam or wood. When you're drawing energy boundaries, they're behaviors and they are dynamic. So like the example, like the Bantam example of a campfire, is that it changes and shifts over time. And so what you're looking at in those examples where the ground is a kind of mingling of the invisible and visible, meaning you can see the base plate, which is giving off temperature. So it's a thermal condition. It's conductive, meaning the material is giving off temperature. The heat rises. And then on the top, you have light. And when the heat rises and temperature from the air drops, you get a convection cycle. So you get air movement, you get light, you get electromagnetic field. Like the idea is that there's multiple things happening. So it's really just a way of how do you balance the difference between what is visible and what is invisible, so that you're not creating something that's all a magic carpet of invisibility, but also a kind of balance between the two. And that's what I think the Gregory Crutzen and the Ruud van Appel are interesting, or the deep fake in general, is that I would venture to say like 90%, 95% is believable. It's only 5% that is sort of smuggled in, that is the kind of content that changes the project. And I think there's a variable, like if it goes down to like 40%, if you tweak that Nancy Pelosi or the Bill Hader example to like 40, you would just become satirical, right? It would just become a funny thing. But if you can kind of smuggle in enough where people are like, oh, I like that, I want to be a part of that, or I want that, you're like, well, 10% or 5% isn't real yet, but we can get there. And so I think that becomes the part that is, because if I told you within those examples, the ones you pointed to, no one's going to question, can you build that base plate? Yeah, I can build that base plate. Can you build a kind of hovering drone system with lighting? Yeah, I can build that. There's proof of it. Can you make that thing connect and get a convection cycle with electromagnetic? That's probably more than 5 or 10%. But if it's just the 5 or 10%, you can get people to say, yeah, we can make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, somehow this is related to me. This like I don't know, like I want to, like, if we just want to say let's produce the effect and not worry if I and my kind of body is going to recognize it, like this, like what can be done to space, to energy, to light, what other just physical properties can be produced that could be steam, whatever. Like when things melt, they, like the solid turns to liquid and it becomes a gas. Like if we experiment with those kinds of things, what then? And then you get a new set of a new kind of effects, I guess, really is what we're talking about, that may or may not be good for humans, or may not be efficient. I guess that's that's a way that I would move it beyond, like, okay, like, do I feel it? Do I see it? Like, I don't know, like, well, maybe if I don't care about that, at least at the beginning, like, then what can I smuggle in? That's the 5 or 10%. Because if I have to have, like, justify it by, like, oh, and you'll get this, or you, this whole you, like, it's an interesting, I don't know, I think it's a problem, that, like, kind of. Now, on the other hand, like, to justify, like, oh, well, we're just going to produce these effects. Maybe you'll notice them, maybe you won't. Like, what's the, who's going to pay for that, or who's going to be interested in that? But I don't, like, at the moment, I think, I don't know. I'm not so well. I'm just not. I don't know if that's productive anymore. So worrying about our response to it. It's more like, well, what can we, what kind of things can we do?
I think that becomes again, we're talking in things that I'm not showing you. But that's part of one of the issues with the Venice project, which will be out in a couple of weeks. I just couldn't. I don't think they're allowing me to show anything. Which was, what is the role of architecture then? Because we are in this system of unknowns. We do have lots of things happening quickly. How do you produce an architectural form and shape that is static, that you invest in, that you build, but then is also updatable? And how do you build in that sort of slippage of being finished, recognized as being complete, but at the same time know that you have a background of buffering where you can add things into it, so that it's not just about a master plan of you or them or him or her, but him and her 5 years from now, him and her when something new happens, and we can do that. How do you allow a system where you can have multiple layers of augmented reality, where if somebody has glasses or has something that allows them to hear ultraviolet or infrared, or allows them to see something else, that can just be an updated feature in the system without having to pull the architectural structure down and rebuild something other. I think there's also ways of even empathy. Like, one of the examples in the Venice is an example of what it's like to see the project if you were colorblind. Like, it's just a slightly different visual. Or, it's not only about you, but sometimes it's about recognizing how it's being perceived by 7% of the population, which is colorblind. And it's not about catering or, like, being altruistic about it, but it's about realizing that it's both seeing what other people can't see, but also knowing that that form has to be adaptable. I'm trying to think of an example of, like, the Tesla cars that now just get updates, where it's not about changing the batteries, it's not about changing your car's system, it's about getting a new update that allows it to function differently. It's about having all of Los Angeles, large chunks of Los Angeles, not changing the infrastructure of the street lighting, but changing phosphorescent lighting to LEDs. So it's a bulb change. It's not a rewiring and restructuring of the lighting system. It's a change of a light bulb. And so I'm not saying architecture needs to be like a Tesla car or lighting systems, but it is, because there is so much happening and we don't know what it is, and we're not going to be building architecture for 6-month periods of time that we can build for 10, 20 years, but a portion of it has to be updatable in a way that allows for growth, but it's still at the same time meet the definitions of seeming complete. I mean, it's a weird, I think architecture is extremely exciting right now, but also extremely difficult. And I think, that's why I think it's pretty exciting, but I do think we have a lot of hurdles to overcome that I don't think necessarily are, definitely are not figured out.
Well, if anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat. I just I have the images that that I pulled. So, but I think one of the things that I'm so you know um, happy for you're bringing in so many different scenarios, different fields. This again, the word I've been using for myself is entanglement, right? That architecture is entangled with film and with art and with energy systems and with thermodynamics. And so I put this image up just more so that tension between like let's call it the traditional model and then the kind of climatic model or the thermal mapping, right? That like the need to find also to go outside of our discipline to reanimate our discipline. So when you're talking about like updates, right, to go into like a kind of computer or digital software, it's not even that, right? Software, hardware, right? That we are so well malleable in the best sense, or we're also so robust that like we can take all these things and still not get lost. That we still like there are disciplinary issues like modeling or representational issues or just spatial issues that like no one is you are not abandoning at all. In fact, all we're trying to do, or all you're trying to do, it seems to me, is augment what the discipline already has. But that means being very flexible and fluid with where you grab things. Now, I mean, I've talked to other people who went to school with us, and they will tell me that's how we were trained. I don't really know. I think architects in general are kind of.
I think so. Yeah.
But anyhow, this idea of bringing in different representational techniques, different are super important. And I don't know, or another example to me would be back to this one, and this was in the show, in the Ambiguous Territory show, so maybe that's why I will come back to it. But I'm sure a lot of people would think this is just Photoshop.
Right, right.
And it's a physical. I didn't want to show like the back, the one where things are dangling. I guess it is a little Photoshop maybe to get some of the things out.
Yeah,
but,
it is a little bit.
This is a model, right? Like this.
Right.
This was a physical model, and it was important to you to do that. I'm guessing for a lot of reasons, but there's a kind of disciplinary consistency there that carries through. And I think it's not about abandoning what we do. It's about augmenting and entangling what we do with these other techniques, fields, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, this is like a 4 foot by 4 foot, model that's then photographed for just one shot. So the whole thing is set up as like a kind of diorama. And it's funny you're talking about the entanglement. I was looking at, sometimes you read books from, say, like social anthropology, like the Donna Haraway's book on Staying with the Troubles, and she's talking about string figures and how to connect things together, and it sounds all super. I mean, she writes beautifully, and her ideas of like worlding worlds, like she has all the phrases that like get your imagination going, but at the same time, no real answers as to what any of that means. Like, can't really point to anything specific, except for maybe some students or artists that are doing something in a tangent way. But when I read that, I think like this is what we do. Like this is us. We are not specialists in anything. We're not mechanical engineers. We're not structural engineers. We're not artists. And at the same time, the people who are making biotechnological devices, people who are working on climate change, people who are doing these technologies, haven't thought about the other sides. And really what we sit in is that little in-between spot where we can grab all those strings from fiction to anthropology to technologies, and we try to understand what the implications of these things are, because quite frankly, we only build years into the future, months into the future. So our job is to not produce something today, but in a near future. And that sort of entanglement idea, I think, is the hallmark of what the discipline is.
So I think we have time for we'll take one more question, then we wrap it. Well, I don't know, like wrap it up or not. I know I have class at 1:30 my time, but we can go to we can start a little late too. But a question about how do you think making what is invisible visible can feed back into the project? And I'm maybe like the way I was interpreting this question. Not that that's my job, but I can't help myself. Is sort of like in a project like this, maybe like on the one hand, making palpable the heat and the melting, does that then feed back the thing itself, the object? Like how does that inform that design or what? I mean, I don't know. The project isn't the thing in this case, or you might even, maybe that's another way of asking this question is like, what is the project? Like, where does it begin and end in a project like this, or it could be the sphere. I mean, all of your work in general. But
Yeah.
how does that engage the thing and how it might be encountered through our senses? How does it change?
So this is a photograph render. So the photographs are the little pods. So those were built as a prototype. They're vacuum formed large pods for sitting. And then I photographed them and then put them in the kind of setting. So the idea between a physical I like the idea of building physical prototypes and testing them, and then also having imagery of the sort of larger spatial conditionings. Unfortunately, the one in Venice could not be prototyped fully, so it's a physical thing sitting there, but it's not operational because, again, things had to be stripped out because of you know what. And so, I mean, my example, the way I was reading that with the visible and the invisible feedback is it's really no different than anything else. It's no different than writing. You could be like, I want to write a book on something, or I want to write an article on this. And then as you start writing it, you're like, well, I didn't even think of that. Like all of a sudden, the idea of articulating your intentions reinforms your intentions so that you understand it better. So you don't write because you know the answers, you write because you have a hunch and you know where you want to go with it roughly. And then active writing gives you feedback to understand how you frame the concept. And it's no different than if you're working in Rhino or whatever, like when you start articulating your ideas, you see it in a new way and it reinforms it. And so the idea of seeing the thermal, seeing acoustics, seeing olfactory senses, seeing infrared, like actually articulating it helps you start realizing its behavior is something different than how you thought, or realizing that the tool you use to articulate it is. Now, my favorite quotes of all time, are Robin Evans quotes about that our modes of representation are never neutral vehicles. They have their own proclivities. They have their own inscription on what you do. And so any tool you pick up to articulate your ideas is going to inform them in ways, whether you're aware of it or not. And so, it's always, anyone, it's the same for everybody. You could have a political view and then someone's like, yeah, why do you think that? And then you start saying it and you're like, shit, I don't really understand what I'm saying. Like, it's just because because you think you know what you're doing, just saying it out loud is a whole other world.
Yeah, I mean, I like that a lot. I mean, I like that I thought we were verging on the political in terms of what one wants to expose or reveal, like, and then what one actually or that feedback between, like what you're saying, like, oh, I want to do this, then you do it, and you're like, oh, but that's not really what I'm doing. Like, actually, I'm doing something else. And then I guess the question will be maybe the first question to tie to the first question we had in the chat about the goal of the work. Like, what's at stake? And maybe is another way of saying these things is there's a goal of, let's say, playfulness. There's a goal of expanding disciplinary boundaries. There's the goal of exasperating certain conditions, is to put them to the breaking point as opposed to solving them. Or showing them at the breaking point. I mean, that's something I know I'm interested in, is exasperating rather than solving.
For sure.
But
for sure.
that only can't, like, I think this is that you can say that I can say it a million times very easily. but it's only when I start getting back into the R disciplinary tool, R representational tools, conventional, and then adding to that one begins to, yeah, like the word you used before, to begin to articulate them to yourself, and then hopefully on to others. But that it also implies not just a feedback loop of like, here's an idea, now I make a drawing, then I test it, and it's like from project to project, like you were saying with architects who get jobs. But like, you've been dealing with the same kinds of problems or issues, and I guess I wonder, yeah, like, how do I want to say this? Yeah, I guess, do you feel you're still dealing with the same issues? Like, it sounds like the virtual reality is a little bit different for, let's say, the energy systems, but no, maybe it's not. Or tell me how it's swerving or how they are connected.
Yeah, no, I think they're very much, I think it's still the same project in many ways. And I think at the end of the day, it's, for instance, so I'm a big fan of science fiction writing, and it's sort of been, I joke sometimes that it's been something that I'm a fan of, but I never know why I'm a fan of it, and it's not something I talk about. But I think in time, I've started realizing more and more how much overlap it is in the work that I'm doing, which is because science fiction, as they say, isn't intended to kind of show you the future or predict the future. It's basically just playing out plausible scenarios, but those scenarios are always tied to some degree of conflict. Like, it's not all smooth going. Like, even so, Kim Stanley Robinson, a super famous contemporary science fiction writer, is always interested in utopia, but even in his utopia, it's all about conflict, and very different opinions and solutions for the same goal. So even if you have a goal and you all agree on the goal, their objectives to get to that are very different. So even if we can agree on a goal, which we don't most of the time, getting to that goal is going to have conflicts in how you choose to get there. And as an architect, what I'm interested in doing is not only being able to produce spaces that that intrigue me, but also realize that in a way is foreshadowing conflict. Like, it's not all going to go smoothly. There are going to be pitfalls that we're not aware of. And I think in many ways, by doing these projects and testing these things, it's to see what opportunities lay out there when we make those string connections that others maybe might not be doing, but also being aware of when there are pitfalls and where there are problems, and kind of highlighting them, and knowing who's included and who is not included, and who's, what ramifications could and could not be. So that's always sort of been the subset. And sometimes it takes a long time to be working on something to realize that what the undercurrent has been for that long. And so that's why when I talk about like the augmented reality for that exhibit Columbus, or the idea of using video gaming, it's really just, I find now to be a much more robust version of a tool to articulate the ideas and explore the ideas. So if before it was simulation software, if it was physical modeling, if it was photographs and testing, if it, this is just another, what I find to be a better way, a more robust way of testing these things out, which I think are still in many ways the same things. Like when I wrote that, when the Air from Other Planets came out, I remember that chapter on the envelope in the human body. That was the chapter I didn't want to talk about when I gave lectures, because I was afraid people were just going to kind of like, not laugh, but like have the most problem with. I'd get the most pushback. And I realize now that, I should have embraced that stronger, because you can't second guess these things. Like, it's just so clearly the two, that it's the body and the space. And so it's the same project. It's just like trying to find different ways of discussing it.
Yeah, I mean, I like this. It's a kind of a bricoleur, a little bit model of art. Like you use what you need to use and what you have, to engage what you have. It's not about. It's as far from, let's say, fashion or planned obsolescence or that kind of, like, you don't use these tools because, oh, look, there's a new tool, it's shiny.
Well, I think like the great quote is like chance favors a prepared mind.
Yeah.
You know, and so, and I think that's true. I think like when you see something, you're like, oh, I could, you know what, I have this thing going on, and this is a great way to kind of show that.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, like you said, if you're just looking for cool tech, I mean, there's no shortage of it, but you're going to go down a weird rabbit hole.
Yeah, but it's also the need to, the need for a different kind of tool or different technique for exposing something that has always been there, right? So like again, I think in the studio we're trying to draw like that. It's still within drawing, mind you, but there's the way we would otherwise draw is not going to do it, and
Right.
so it's okay. It's not a it's not like the other. But not to say they're obsolete or that we'll never come back to it or other functions for it, but that you also you gotta grab what you can, and certainly your career and your work. We could have if we just went through all the things has always done that. I mean, like the plans. I think there's only one plan in this also show some of that as well. Anyhow, Sean, thank you. This has been super fun. We should get together more often, non-formally, but or Manuel, invite us to other events so we can talk across hemispheres, as it were. But thank you, Sean, and thanks for coming and for enlightening me and us and others who will view it, I think, in the future. So, Manuel,
thanks for the invite.
Any closing?
David, I think it was great. I was really amazed by the conversation. I was thinking about what you can see as a human would be like. So I think it was very interesting how you revolved around that idea, and and maybe how post-humanist skyscrapers or architecture in general is for non-humans, but made by architects that are something other than human, maybe, who can see, what you can see as an architect that is not a human anymore, or something else. We don't know. Okay, Sean, David, thank you for the conversation. It was great. I'm sure we're gonna see you both back again soon.
All right.
And thanks for everybody that attended to the conversation. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Manuel. See you.
Thank you.